Thank you all for being here today. My name is Marcy Wilburn and I'm the Associate Director of the IEP-TA Center. How many of you are familiar with the IEP-TA Center, formerly known as the Indiana IEP Resource Center? I see some familiar faces. How many of you is this the first training that you've ever been to from this center? Okay, wonderful. Well, welcome again. We are going to talk a lot about navigating special education. And specific to charter schools, we really made this presentation specific to you all and really looking at your settings that you have in place now and what that means in following Article 7 for special education students. So if you have specific questions, concerns throughout the day, please feel free to pose those and ask those questions. We definitely want to make sure that we're meeting your needs today. You'll see this list. We have several people who are presenting today, so I'm just kicking off. I have a short time frame, and then we'll pass it up so you get to hear additional people as well. All of these individuals can come into your schools and provide presentations to your teachers. We'll talk a little bit about some of the topics that you can have requested into your district. If you open up on the left side of your folder, you have a brochure that talks about some of the services that our center provides. You also have a flyer for our Elevating Education Conference, which we have state and national presenters coming to, so that will take place in November. Would love to see teams from your schools attend that. And then underneath that, we have a flyer called What Administrators Need to Know About Special Education. A lot of the content within this training is what you're going to receive today, but it's not specific necessarily to charter schools. But if there's information that you are getting today and you think, oh, so-and-so in my building needs to hear this, then these are some good options for them to be able to attend. So if you think, okay, we have half the people here that need to get this information, but maybe some more might be beneficial later, then that's something I would highly recommend of passing along those dates and times to those individuals. You also have your PowerPoint in your folder so you can follow along with us today. When we talk about special education, we need to make sure we have some foundational beliefs in place in order to ensure that all students can be successful. So as we're looking here at our first belief, we believe that all students can learn and achieve great things. If I were to pose the question, how many of you believe that? I would expect, with people watching, all of you would raise your hand, right? I mean, we want to believe this. We want all of our students to learn and to achieve great things. But in the back of your head, there might be that one student that you're thinking, whew, I'm not sure if this student can learn and achieve great things. But we have to have this belief, especially as leaders in our buildings, so that that trickles down to the people who are boots on the ground working with our students day in and day out. Now, when we have this belief, we see different things in buildings. So there are look-fors that we see. If we truly believe that all students can learn and achieve great things, are we having learning targets posted for all the students within our building? Are we creating high expectation and not watering down content for students who are struggling? Excuse me. We need to make sure that we're scaffolding supports so that students can meet those high expectations. So think about the classrooms within your buildings. You probably have a degree of where teachers fall within learning and achieving to high standards. And the way that they're implementing those practices in their rooms can really give you an idea of where do they fall? Do they truly believe this? And if not, how do we help them to be more successful so that they can believe it and start to build on these foundational beliefs? Because if we don't think they can do it, then they're not going to be able to do it. So we have to make sure we're passing these beliefs on to others. Next, we believe that all students are general education students first. Strongly, we need to make sure that students are receiving a free and appropriate public education and make sure they're seen as general education students. So again, all hands up, we want to say this, but what does it look like in your building? Is every student assigned to a general education teacher? Is there conversation about your students and my students between gen ed teachers and special ed teachers? Or better yet, are they our students? We are all working together to meet the needs of all learners within our building. Just because they're on my caseload as a special ed teacher doesn't mean they're mine. I can't fix everything just because I have a special education teaching license, right? I need to work with my general ed counterparts who have that understanding of the content knowledge that needs to take place at each grade level to ensure, going back to number one, I have those high expectations for students within my building. So things that you want to look for these foundational beliefs. And lastly, we believe that in order to meet the needs of all students, it's necessary to meet the needs of each student. So how are we providing opportunities where students can be successful in ways that work for them? Okay, think to yourself. I'm going to give you a minute or so, not quite. Where do you fall in your 3 beliefs? Personally, Likert scale, 0 to 5. Then think of your system. What rating would you give your system or your building on a Likert scale of 0 to 5? Just thinking about it. You don't have to tell me. Like rating 0 to 5 yourself personally, and then your system. So you're strong, you're a 5, I believe all these things. But my system's maybe about a 2.5. And then if you are that strong 5, what are some action items that you can do to help other people get towards that 5 within your building? Because when these beliefs are in place, it makes your job as a leader a lot easier in order to support all students within your environment. So again, foundation to the work that we do. So education looks a little bit like this. The way that we get places, whether we're a student, an educator, or an admin team, looks very different. Not every student is going to master a standard in the exact same way. The target's the same, but our path there can be all different directions. Teachers, we can present lessons differently, but we have standards that we're trying to meet, that we need to meet. And as an admin team, you have goals that you need to meet, but the way that you get there might be different. So we're going to talk today about policies and procedures, and you need to make them your own for the system that you're serving. Now the target's the same, it's the law, right? That's what we're going to be talking about today. But the way that you get there and you lead your people to that point can look very different. Some of you might say, well, after all this talk today, I think I'm just going to walk down the steps and head on out. But our hope is that we can give you the tools and the resources in order to be successful. And if you leave here with questions, know that that is what our team is for. We are here to support you. So you will leave here with contact information on our last slide. And if you are developing policies and procedures around something and have questions or concerns, please, we're a phone call away, an email. Give us a call, let us know how we can support you. Because we definitely don't want you walking down those stairs. We want you to figure out how to get to that point that you want to be so that you can serve students and really have those foundational beliefs in the forefront. So we said that we took this training and it really started with our what admin need to know about special education. And our goal was to customize it specifically for charter schools. So we had to ask the question, well, what's different for charters? I'm going to start out by saying, not a whole lot. As public schools, you are held accountable for all of the things that any other school would be held accountable for. So we didn't have to change a whole lot, but your situations and the resources and the setups within your system look different. So your path might be different on how you get to that point. So that's what we want to give you information on today. Lastly, I want to point out the child find efforts. So child find for a district is I have a regional area. and I have to look for students who potentially need additional supports in school settings and see if they are eligible for special education services. You all don't have a specific region in which you're serving, right? Students are coming to you from all over. So your job is, when they come in that door, are they eligible? Are they not? Are they struggling? Are they not? And those are the questions you're going to answer. So that's really, when we talk about big differences, child finds that big difference. The rest is going to look very similar, but how you get there and the resources and the setup of your system might change your path to get there. Keys to a quality education plan for students. We definitely have to look at the procedures that we have in place. We're going to spend a lot of time today talking about that. So is there a process for developing IEPs within your system to better serve students? And what does that look like? And if you don't have a process in place, put that high at the top of your list of action items for when you leave here today, because our educators need to know, what's the expectation? What do I need to do? Does the IEP contain all required information? And if you're using the computerized system provided by the state, it makes sure that you put in the information. It's important that you have all aspects of that. None of those red stop signs within the system telling you, wait, I didn't do this part. But not only does it need to be a policy and procedure that you're doing all of those things, it also needs to be quality. Just because I can check a box doesn't mean that what's written in there is helpful. You can just type your fingers and that red stop sign goes away, right? But I want it to have meaningful impact, and the words that are in there mean something for that student. And how do I make sure that's happening? So, is the content sufficient for student progress? Do we have a way to measure whether the student's successful or not? What does that progress monitoring look like? Is it data collected over time, or is it right before progress reports are due? I'm going to hurry up and do an assessment and drop a number in that progress report. We really want to look at over time, because, to the next point, if it's not working, we need to make some instructional changes for that student. And I recognize that everyone is busy, and we have to do an annual case review. You have to meet on an annual basis. But if you wait 6 months and there's no progress and there's no meeting called to change what's happening for that student, we're wasting our teachers' time and our students' time. That is not fair to them. So sometimes we have to look at information more frequently in order to do what's best for our students. So making sure we're monitoring progress over time and making instructional decisions based off of that information that we're getting. And lastly, what is outlined in the IEP needs to be done, right? If we say we're going to do it, then we have to put it in place. And I think what's so important is we want the IEP to have all of this great information in it, but then if we're not implementing it, it doesn't serve its purpose either, right? So it's twofold. We need great content in the IEP, and we need to be able to implement. So as we're writing these documents or training our teachers to write these documents, we have to say it has to be something that you can maintain and that you can do. And as case conferences are coming up with solutions and ways to help students, is that feasible within our system? And if it needs to be done, we have to make sure that it's feasible so that students can be more successful. And lastly, make sure parents are involved at all aspects throughout. As you're working through and planning, of course, they're going to be members of that case conference committee. As we're thinking, we're 6 months in and we don't see progress, we need to have a phone call with them, have a meeting with them, and change things up a little bit. But they need to be actively involved in all of the participation in terms of what their student is and what the plan's going to be for their student. So today's agenda, we are going to talk about legally compliant procedures and accountability. What are the things that you must do, and how do you ensure that they're happening within your system? We're going to talk about leading IEP meetings. Some of you might be in that role. If you're not, you can share that information with those who are facilitating those meetings and really the ones who are going through each step of the process. We're going to talk about challenging behaviors. Especially since COVID, we've heard a lot of districts And schools tell us that behavior is something that we are dealing with more frequently than we were before. And so just giving some strategies in order to help students navigate those big feelings and emotions. And then lastly, talking about policies and procedures and best practices. And the importance of, once those are established, how are we communicating those to the people who need to follow them, and what's that training process look like? Okay, the last thing I want to go through are some resources for you today, just to kick off the introductory portion. You have the QR code in your slide deck. You can also take your phone and snap it up here. If you have a device like a laptop, then you can type in the URL as well, and you can use that. I'll give you a couple minutes before I switch screens. So this is the Padlet that you have access to. Again, you have that link and QR code in your PowerPoint, so if you haven't gotten to it yet, you still can. You will notice this is our Padlet for special education for administrators. So the PowerPoint that you all have is specific to charter schools, so we changed some things a bit. This is the one for our full day training for administrators, but you have access to that as well. And basically what we do with Padlets, they're amazing because as we change them, or we update information on them or add an additional resource, you have access to them in real time. So this link, as long as we're here, that link's going to be live and you can go and access these later. So if you are going to start co-teaching in a building and you need help with scheduling, you know you can come here and find some resources. There's also some text resources that we find that are very helpful. Some video resources as well, some research articles, and then other resources as well, and then of course any of your meeting resources that you need when it comes to case conferences or anything like that. We will address the Padlet throughout today. We won't necessarily pull it back up for you again, but we will go through and talk about, oh, in the Padlet you can find this resource. Or if any of you are like, I really need something for this, and we're like, ooh, we have something that could be helpful, then we'll make a note and we'll add it in at the end of the day or tomorrow so that then you have access to it. So this will be up and ready for you to go through as needed in due time. All right, I'm going to pass it over to Angie now to talk about procedures and accountability.
Procedures. All right, this doesn't sound very fun. But as far as accountability, there are some certain things that are part of the law that we just absolutely have to do. And knowing those is usually the issue. It's not always doing them. Generally, as educators, if I know I'm supposed to do something, I'm going to do it. I don't purposefully not do something. Most of the time when I fail at something, it's because I didn't know. Like I didn't know when I was supposed to do that or what the time frame was or how it was supposed to happen. And so that's what we want to make you aware of, kind of the first couple of parts that we're going to go through. And the first is notice of procedural safeguards. So you're going to see the acronym NOPS, but what we really know this as is parent rights, right? We talk about parent rights. They just don't call them parent rights. Because at some point, the parent rights are not the rights of the parent anymore. They become the rights of the student when the student turns 18. So it's just the procedural safeguards, all of the different things that we have to follow. So a couple of things to know about this. First of all, we have to give notice. Notice being sometimes the procedural safeguards and sometimes notice being a copy of the IEP. There are a lot of things that are noticed, which usually means we got to put them in writing in some form. We have to give this to the parents so that they actually have this. So we always give notice to parents if we're proposing to change something. Change a goal, change a service, change placement, change teachers. I mean, even when we change a teacher, even though that isn't usually in the IEP, we let parents know. We don't want them finding out things that we should have told them and given them notice of. We put things in writing. If we're going to have a meeting, parents get an actual paper form that says, here's when the meeting is, here's who's going to be there, here's what the time is, here's what the purpose is. All of those things require notice in writing. Some other things in writing, oh yes,
Are we open to questions?
absolutely.
Well, I just wondered when it says, since we're in this technological age, a lot of times we provide the parents this information and give them available dates. Can we keep that
Yes.
as the?
Okay, so let's talk about that. Are you talking specifically for notice of meetings?
Yes.
Okay, so here's the issue. There is a form located within the IEP system that generates a notice of conference. Many of you are going to also have teachers who are reaching out to parents, sending them an email, sending them a text, sending them something through your school's communication system that says, we're thinking about a meeting on this date, what do you think? That is still great, but it does not serve as the written notice, because there are lots of things that are required by law to be part of that written notice. Things like, you can bring somebody with you if you want. Here's what the purpose is of the meeting. Here are all the people who are going to be there and in what different roles. Where's the location? And a lot of times we would leave a few of those things out. If your written notice had everything required by law, it would serve as the written notice, but you run a big risk of forgetting one little piece, and one little piece will do you in, right? So even if you're doing all that other stuff of, I'm waiting in the car line, right, to try and get mom and say, are you free in 2 Thursdays from now? Document that in the system. That is a great piece to document that I had a face-to-face contact, but make sure and give that advanced written notice of the meeting that includes all that stuff. That's a great question though, because it's something that comes up a lot in all schools across the state. We don't do evaluations without having something in writing that gave the parent adequate notice of everything and allowed them to consent to it. We also don't place kids in special education without written consent. So there are all those little pieces that we have to follow. And there's also information in the parent rights or in the notice of procedural safeguards about independent evaluations. And there's a lot of information in there about how to request, what happens if you request, what happens if a school says yes. So many things that are included. So there are a lot of key things that are about giving notice. Well, our legal responsibility as schools is to respond to that parent request, right? So if I want an evaluation for my child, I go to the school, right? If I want it to be free, I go to the school and say, I would like my child evaluated, and then you respond to that. And then there are procedures for whether you said yes or no, what I need to do. But a parent is entitled to ask for, not necessarily to receive, but to ask for an independent evaluation at the public agency's cost for every evaluation that we do. So if I haven't done one as a school, I'm not paying for yours, right? But if I did one and the parent says, yeah, I don't really agree with that, and they don't even have to tell you, you can ask why they disagreed or what they had a problem with. They don't have to tell you technically. But if they disagree with one that you did, they can then ask for an independent evaluation. And then there are procedures from there about, we either do it, and there's some parameters around that. It has to be all the same stuff we would do at the school. It has to be within a reasonable location. You know, they can't say, well, I want this $10,000 evaluation that's in Hawaii, and all my family needs to go, right? You can't do things like that. There are parameters, definitely. But the school can also say, you know what, we're willing to go to due process because we believe so strongly that our evaluation was perfectly adequate. It's a decision that you have to make. All right, so let's talk about when you give that document. And you can get the document from the Department of Education's website. You can get that, I believe we have it on the Padlet. You can get it in multiple languages, and that's important, right? If your parent can't read it, or your parent can't understand it, we have to make sure that that happens. And sometimes that's challenging. But some districts actually will take the information from this form, and I've seen some places that have shrunk it down to a booklet. It has to contain all the information, so they can't change anything, but they've changed the font, they've changed the format a little bit, and packaged it as their own. Quite honestly, it's just as easy to print it directly. You can put it on your website, which is great, but that does not take the place of actually giving it to the parent. And so when do you have to give it? That's the big question. You have to give it when you get that initial referral. And you want to make sure that you're giving it before a parent signs anything. It's like, you get those Apple updates all the time that I'm like, yeah, click, I agree. I didn't read it. And sometimes it's scary. You don't know what you're agreeing to. And we are responsible for making sure that our parents understand everything that they are signing for, and they understand all the rights and responsibilities associated with that. So, initial referral or parent request. Unfortunately, we got to talk about this. If you're in a situation where a parent files a complaint or files for due process, then you have to give yet another copy of that notice of procedural safeguards to the parents for the first complaint and the first due process of any year. If you've got a parent who's filing multiple complaints, you only have to do it the first time, so that lets you off the hook a little bit with that. If the student is being removed, and we'll talk a lot more about this afternoon, removed meaning they've had suspension, expulsion, whatever, that has taken them past that 10-day mark and it has resulted in a change of placement, then on the day that you decide this is the discipline we're handing down and it's going to result in that, you have to get a copy to the parents, which means the administrators in the buildings are the ones that really need to know that, because they're the ones who are getting that letter ready saying your child is going to be suspended for this many days. We know that it's going to result in us going to a manifestation determination. With that letter should go a copy of the notice of procedural safeguards, because there are some rights associated with that parents need to understand. And the last one is, yeah, anytime a parent asks, we give another copy. I don't care if you've given them 10 that year. If they ask for another copy because their desk is like mine and it's piles of stuff that I can't figure out where anything is, yeah, you give them another copy. Other than that, the standard is you give it every year when you have your annual meeting. Now, I've seen a lot of meetings where it gets set on the table and says, do you want this copy? Don't ask them that. It's, I'm giving you this copy. Let's talk about any questions that you have. Now, if they leave it there, that's okay. You gave them a copy. But you can't just say, do you want another copy? Because most parents are going to say, I could wallpaper my house with the pages that you've given me of the notice of procedural safeguards. Now, here's the next piece. Can you explain what's in those? It is not parent friendly. I'm sorry, it's just not. It's a lot of legal terminology. And so we have to be able to put it into words. Now, I'll give you an example of what not to do. One of my directors in a previous life, I was a school psychologist and an assistant director, and my director went to a parent who was already on fire, already upset about something, and said, here are your parent rights. Would you like me to explain them to you or read them to you? And the parent said, go ahead and read them. An hour later, we all came back in the room, and my director read word for word that entire document. She was just as hoarse as can be by the end. Parents don't want these read to them. And in fact, they don't need every piece explained to them. But it's important to give them the gist of it, some important points so that they know what it's about. Because if you ask a parent, here's your rights, do you have any questions? They don't know what questions to ask. I mean, what would you ask? You know, explain this to me. Well, most of them have not cracked this yet, right? They haven't opened them necessarily. So giving them some information about what's really important to know, and that you can always come to me if you have more questions. That's really important, because it does say that a parent needs to provide informed consent. I'm not informed by the paper sliding across the table. One thing that I like to do is just develop an elevator speech. And my elevator speech is really different depending on the situation. So I'm going to give you a little demonstration of my elevator speech. When I come into a meeting, most of the time I was coming in as a school psychologist, and most of the time it was because we were reviewing evaluation results. And so I would give the parents their parent rights, say, I know we've gone over these before, but I want you to understand that there's some really important things in here that you need to know for today. There's a lot of other stuff that hopefully you will never even care about related to discipline, because your child's an angel. We will never be there, but there is stuff in there to protect you and to protect your child if need be. But today you need to know that all the information we talk about is confidential. All of the information in your child's record is kind of like doctor's records. We're not going to release them to anyone outside of this school unless you move, and then it goes with your child. But otherwise, we need your consent to make it happen. So it is confidential information. Everything that we do today, you're part of. You are part of this team, and we need to know that, you know, you're going to be invited to every meeting. You're going to be informed of changes. And even if we decide that your child is eligible after we go over all the test results, it still takes your consent before we start anything. Then we're going to have a meeting after that, at least every year. But if you ever need a meeting or you think something needs to change, you can ask for a meeting, or we can ask for a meeting. That's about as far as I go into it, right? But those are some of the key ideas from the Notice of Procedural Safeguards. Now, if I'm there for a manifestation determination, you better believe I'm talking about all of the things related to discipline. But just giving them enough to think, I may want to open that document and read a little bit more can be really helpful. So I want to turn that back to you guys, because you've probably all been in case conferences. Maybe a few of you haven't, but most of you have been in these meetings. I want you to talk just at your table for a minute about what things would you want to include. I'm coming at it from a psychologist perspective. If this is an annual case review or some of the meetings that you may have sat in on that you think, oh, I wish the parent really understood this piece, what would you want to tell them? So talk about that just for a minute at your table. Okay, who came up with something that they felt like parents have got to know this? There was a lot of good conversation happening. What would you want to make sure that, if nothing else, I tell them this?
Okay, so what I was disclosing to her was, in my school, we have a lot of 18 throughout, right? And so if they are the parent and there's no persons with them, and they are also a student with a disability, how do we now help them understand that procedural safeguard?
Right. And that can be hard.
That is.
And if a student really would struggle so much to understand those pieces, they may need to have an educational representative.
Yeah.
And we can do that as well.
Okay.
Or encouraging them that, you know, one of your parent rights, and then as a student that's an adult, their right is, I can bring somebody. I can bring somebody that's in my corner, that knows me well, that just makes me feel calm, right? We don't ask any questions about, why are you bringing this person, right? Whether it's an advocate, whether it's a neighbor, whether it's grandma, I don't care. If that person serves a purpose in the parent's mind, that's all we need to know. So it can just be my buddy, right? I take my girlfriend along lots of places because I like having her there, and that's okay.
Can I ask you quickly? As far as, it's maybe not even a question, it may be a case by case, but what if we have had situations where, younger siblings have been there and felt that they could share. How much of that do we tolerate? Like they want to, put their 2 cents about their brother or sister, and it's not always positive in light of our staff. And I felt like I just wanted to shut that down because it's like, you're a guest here. You don't get to have that opinion. You're 14.
Boy, that's a hard one because they can have that opinion, but we can set parameters as to the rules and expectations of a group. So if our ground rules are we're going to, limit our conversation to these topics, or that we're going to stick to data, right? I love data. As a psychologist, I love data, and data helps suck the emotion out of a lot of stuff. For example, if I tell you that a student is lazy and unmotivated, my emotions are just pouring out. If I tell you that the student has only turned in 50% of homework assignments and that I've counted, and on average they put their head down on their desk at least 5 times per class period, that's data. That's not assuming anything about the student. So maybe that's how you handle it, because again, we don't tell a parent, oh, you can't bring that person.
So it's just sort of a preemptive thing.
Yeah.
Perfect.
Yeah. Sometimes when we know what the meeting dynamics are, it helps us to set up a situation that's going to deal with some of those barriers. Uh-huh.
I just want to make a comment. My sister and my nephew evaluated, and the administrators, the principal was like, so we just want to hear from Ms. Allen and try to hush me up. That's not possible, but okay. And what I told her was, it's a reason why my sister asked me to come here.
Absolutely.
And that for that reason, I'm going to ask questions and I'm going to make a comment. She tried to just like shut us, because my sister also had an advocate. So she had me and an advocate, and it was not what they wanted. So they tried to hush us up. I just would say, be very careful with that, because I'm there for a reason. I'm not just there because I want to take time out, but obviously I'm giving some support to that parent, to that scholar, to someone that's there. They asked me to come, so I need to be there.
We're talking about another child, though.
Yeah, well, I mean, they may have an opinion about their sibling as well, something that you may not know. You know, my sister loves to play with her cars or whatever, I don't know.
Right.
But they may have some insight that can actually add to that meeting. I mean, parameters are fine, but just be open and just imagine if it's your child or if it's you, that you need that support. That's all.
I think that's a really good point. I can think back to a case conference one time where the parents were so at odds with the school that they did have an advocate with them, and the advocate walked into the meeting and said, they will not be speaking, I will be speaking for them. And as a person, I'm thinking, heck no, that we need the parents involved, but the parents were not going to speak because they were just not comfortable yet. But by the time the meeting was about halfway through, because of the things that the team was doing and trying to set up situations where the parents felt comfortable, they felt like equal members of the team, which is incredibly important, they suddenly said, we can talk now. And it was a beautiful meeting for the rest of the meeting. But it took work on the part of the school team to make that happen. Yeah, so relationships are so valuable throughout the whole process. I have also seen, I worked in a district where every employee had a cheat sheet. We didn't give these out to parents, but we had a cheat sheet of here are some key things from parent rights to share. We can't give those to parents because they need the whole thing. but it can help guide our conversation. And I've also seen some districts who have used like a laminated sheet that said, for every meeting, confidentiality, parent participation, you know, whatever it is that we want to make sure and emphasize from the procedural safeguards. All right, so let's move on to timelines. Kind of a painful process sometimes in special education because we work so hard. We know we're working hard to make all these things happen, and there are some critical timelines, and then there are timelines that really don't get you in a whole lot of trouble, but they're still required by law. And you never know from day to day which things are going to be the ones that, you know, cost you and get you pulled into a hearing, and which ones are going to be, you know, we did the best we could. That really does fluctuate over time. So we're going to hit some of these key ones, but I would encourage you to, you know, every now and then take Article 7 to bed with you and just sit there and read for pleasure, because there's so much in there. We would never get through the entire thing in a day. So we're going to start by just talking about kind of what the process tends to look like for special education, just in general, and it deviates from this a little bit. But we start by saying, okay, we think either from the parent perspective, the school perspective, or jointly, we think that this student has a disability. So there is a referral that's coming from somewhere. After we have a referral, we have to have an evaluation, and there are timelines associated with that as well, and we'll cover all of those. After the evaluation, a team gets together. So we've got two teams kind of operating. We have a multidisciplinary team that does the evaluation, and then we have a case conference committee that sits and meets about that evaluation and makes a determination of eligibility. There's a lot of overlap between those two, but it's not, you know, one team just moving to another room. It truly can be a different makeup depending on what we're looking for. So we meet and we determine, does the student meet the criteria as a student with a disability or not? And if they are eligible, then we have to develop the program. Individualized education program, and it includes lots of stuff. So we create that IEP, and for that first process, even if the parent has sat there, we have all agreed this student is eligible, absolutely, this student has a specific learning disability, we create this beautiful plan. Again, that very first time, the parent has a ton of power, because they can say, sign it and let's go, or they can say, you know what, I changed my mind, not interested. And that's okay. That is part of how powerful it is to be in that role of a parent, is I get to make that decision for my child. Now it's a little bit different, because once I step in that door and I have signed permission, it gives the school just a little bit more freedom to keep things going, because we're now obligated to provide services unless a parent signs that notice or revokes consent for everything. After they're in, we keep things going, and we'll talk more about those pieces as well. But this is kind of the general process of how it happens, and we've got timelines that are associated with a lot of this different stuff that is part of that initial process and also part of the process once a student is in. So we're going to start with looking at that referral piece. Now, with a school referral, when we figure out that we think a student has a disability, we get on it, right? We figure out we've got this much data, and if we have data that says we now believe this student is going to need special education, then we approach the parent about that and try to get that consent. But there's no days kind of timeline to say, oh my gosh, on this date, you had a conversation and you suspected the student had a disability. There's not really a hard and fast timeline about how many days you need to get that parent consent or anything like that. But it is different when a parent refers their child. So number one, the referral from a parent, or that request for evaluation, can be in writing, which we love, right? Because we've got good documentation, or it can just be verbally. And it's to any certified staff member, which means classroom teacher. You're having a parent-teacher conference and you say, you know, I really want my child tested. Boom, that's day 0. Which means all of your gen ed teachers need to know, if you ever get a parent who makes that referral, you need to come to me right away. You need to let somebody know, because now the clock is ticking, and within 10 instructional days, so there are some places in Article 7 that are instructional days and some that are business days. And you gotta know the difference between those, because that can make a big difference about whether you meet that timeline. So within 10 instructional days now, we are obligated to respond to the parent in writing about, are we going to proceed with this or are we going to refuse it? Always when you're doing this, use the forms that are provided within the is everybody here on the electronic system? Okay, awesome. Use the forms, because just like a notice of conference, there are specific legal requirements that have to be in that response, and these have them all built in. My best advice is, when you've got a parent who wants an evaluation, schedule a meeting. Within that 10 days, say, come on in, let's talk about it. Because sometimes your data at school may say, I wouldn't have thought to refer this kid. But sometimes a parent will meet with you and say, well, let me tell you, we have this outside evaluation, or they have a diagnosis of this, right? There's lots of stuff that may not be in the record and you may not necessarily see, and you want to make sure that you can cover all your bases and that you've got all available data before you make that decision. Can't always happen, right? Meeting's hard to make happen within 2 school weeks. That can be difficult. But even if it's a phone conference, anything to help give you the information that you need. All right, now we got a lot of timelines and parents have fewer timelines, but it's a busier world, it really is. So there's really not, for things like, I've sent this consent home with a parent, there's no like clock ticking that say, oh, after this many days, it's null and void, right? And it leaves schools a lot of times thinking, I'm not sure, is this really still open? Is it still pending? I don't know what to think. Usually directors within your system will have some kind of procedure to say, after so many days, if you haven't heard back from a parent on signing a consent, they'll have a process. This is something that could go into your policies and procedures, that we send a letter home saying, you know, we sent you this, here's another copy. I'd like to hear from you within so many days, or else we're going to consider this closed and we'll have to start over. There's really not a lot of guidance around that. Anything that any of you all do when you are waiting and waiting and waiting? Do you have form letters? Do you have requirements in-house that I'm going to send that consent home 3 times? Or are your parents just showing up and signing?
90% of the time the parents show up and sign it, but on the rare occasion when they don't, it's that 3 strikes policy of
3 attempts.
I called it,
Mm-hmm.
emailed it, and the 3rd time it may be another phone call, email, and send it snail mail, just so that
Yeah.
this way we've got the documentation to say we attended it. We did our part in making sure the parent gave us the consent, and they never consented for it.
And having some kind of something in your policy promotes that equity, because what you don't want is one parent that just got the 1 form and nobody ever followed up, and another parent that got the 3 attempts in different formats. You know, you want to make sure everybody's getting that same opportunity to be able to get their ducks in a row. I mean, I'm one of those people that I get that second notice on that stupid toll going over into Louisville, and I'm like, ugh. So I pay the late fee, right? I'm a second notice kind of gal. And I think for a lot of our parents, you get the first form and you're like, okay, I'll get to that. I set it aside in the pile and it's like, it gets buried under other things. So always making sure that you have multiple attempts at anything that you're doing, because this could change the course for a student. All right, initial evaluations. Initial evaluations are critical. If your district, your school, whatever, misses one initial evaluation, you're on the bad list. You're out of compliance. The expectation is 100% compliance. Not everything is this way, but initial evaluations definitely are. Now, most initial evaluations have to be completed within 50 instructional days of when we receive the consent. Now, that's important, because if I sign it on the 10th, but I don't get around to bringing it back to the school until the 21st is day 0. So I would encourage you, whoever takes in those evaluation forms, that they write on there date received, so that it can be documented and put in your system and you can track those days accordingly. We need 50 days for most evaluations. We just really do. I mean, I feel like as a psychologist, it takes several weeks of working with a kid and talking to people and looking at the forms to get a good picture. And I don't want to place a child in special education by taking a glance, right? I want all of the information. So we want to make use of all of those days. Now, a couple of exceptions to this. It is a 20-day timeline if this is following the RTI or MTSS kind of process where we put some interventions in place. We've had good discussions about after this many days we should expect this much growth, and it didn't happen. So we've already collected a lot of data as part of that. Now, that does not mean that every kid who's getting an intervention is going to be on a 20-day timeline. That means that we've got a solid intervention process, that we've talked ahead of time with the parent about how many days we've met, we've collected data along the way. You got to do a good job to really place a student appropriately based on this kind of data. We also sometimes have those students who I just got a 15-day suspension and mom says, let's do an evaluation. If they are in that process of suspension or expulsion and the referral happens, it's now a 20-day, because time's critical. I mean, especially for a student who might be pending expulsion, then we need to get that evaluation completed so that we can have a good consideration about was the behavior related to disability or not. So those are painful. They really are. They're painful for all of your staff involved in doing that evaluation, and I know a lot of you contract for a lot of those services. That's just kind of the norm with most charter schools is we've got contract out for OT, for speech, for psychologists, all of that kind of stuff, and that it can be problematic. So we want to try and keep those as tight as possible. So what do you do when your clock is ticking and the kid's absent, and then suspended for a day, and then absent? What do you do?
Our kids are never absent.
That is awesome.
I'm just kidding.
Uh-huh.
Call home and say, hey, we want to evaluate your child tomorrow. And you
Please bring them in.
make sure they're here on time and meet them at the door.
And I assume, just from experience, that most of you do not have transportation. Is that correct? A lot of charter schools do not have a busing system, and so you may have more trouble with getting kids to school sometime just because it's not coming to their door, right? And if mom's car is broken down, or dad doesn't have any more gas money for the week, or whatever, that can be a problem as far as getting kids to school. So I agree, that's a good thing to do, make that contact at home. I know that if I've had a kid that I've tried to test multiple times and they've been out, I usually had covered multiple buildings, so I would put a call in and I would make especially contact with that school secretary to say, I need to test Johnny this week. The second he shows up, call me. And I will rearrange my schedule and I will get there because this one has to get done. Ultimately, this is one of the potential excusals for missing an evaluation deadline is when the parent has repeatedly failed to produce the student. But it's risky, right? It expects that we are doing our due diligence to try our best to make it happen. So just that I showed up 3 times and they were sick 3 times, that doesn't count as a good excuse. It has to be that we have tried and tried and tried, and this kid is just not here. All right, reevaluation is another one that's a little bit tricky. For some reevaluations, if I'm looking for anything new or different, we are on a 50-day instructional day schedule because we want to get it done and potentially make changes. If anything's going to change in that IEP, we want it done within those 50 days, just like we would for an initial evaluation. So if I'm looking to dismiss, if I'm looking to add an eligibility area, if I'm looking to add a service, if I just need to know some information to make changes to the IEP, 50 days. If it's, you know, we haven't tested this kid for 6 years, we know they're still going to qualify, I just need some updated information, then we can do it and conference it by the next ACR. That's kind of the bottom line. All right, so some more timelines that are really, really important. When we're doing an initial evaluation, there are a couple of things that parents can request, and they can actually request this on the consent form when they first sign it. But they don't have to do it then, right? They can ask for it later, but that's just a good opportunity for them to check yes and sign it. Number one, they can ask to have a copy of the report provided to them or made available to them, I think is the actual language, at least 5 days prior to the meeting. Even if parents don't ask for this, I do it. Because parents need time to digest this information, to read through it, to make notes, to ask questions. If they do not request it though, and maybe for some reason it wasn't done quite then, you have to make sure that they have one available at the meeting. So, and we do that at no cost. We can't charge for copying, for anything like that. The other thing that they can ask for, and this is not at least 5 days, this is within 5 days prior to your scheduled meeting, parents can ask for another meeting, which is basically just sitting down with somebody who is either part of that evaluation team or that at least can explain the results to them. This is a great option for parents. It really is, because to sit in a room with 7, 8 people and ask my questions is one thing. To sit down with one person and say, let's just talk about the results so I feel more competent coming into that bigger meeting can really take some of that pressure off. And there are some times when a parent needs to hear that information and grieve. I mean, think about maybe the first conversation that you've had with a parent saying your child has an intellectual disability. That's hard. And I don't like to cry in front of people, but I will. And if you were to tell me that about my child in a meeting full of people, I'm going to have a hard time pulling it together. That's what this was really designed for. So I would encourage you to use this and to encourage that of your parents too, that, you know, you can always cancel it. If you get the report, you read it and go, yeah, I got it. You can cancel that meeting. And it's not a formal IEP meeting, it's just a quick sit down, or it could be a phone meeting or a Zoom meeting or something like that. All right, another thing that's in the law is that we have to at least consider, in a formal way, doing a reevaluation at least 3 years. It used to be the requirement back in my early days, which was a long time ago now, that we retested kids every 3 years. No ifs, ands, or buts. The testing load was crazy. Now it doesn't say that we have to do it. It says we have to look at all the data that we have and determine, do we need some additional assessments? Now, luckily, the way the IEP system is set up, you're doing it every year. You're answering on a box whether or not you need new information. But we have to make sure that in those meetings that we're actually having that discussion. We're not just checking the box without discussing it. We're saying, you know, do we think everything's accurate? Do we need any updates? I would also encourage you to think about any new assessments. Are they things that need a multidisciplinary team or just the teacher to do some updated assessment? Most of the time, what teachers do with their students to get good feedback, it tells me more than giving a Woodcock Johnson or a Sanford Binet or a WISC, or, you know, those things are part of the process, but how I do on actual classwork tells me a lot more in many cases. IEPs, we generally write them for a year, but not always. Sometimes we have students who are on a homebound placement. We're only going 60 days at a time there. Sometimes we are just going to write a change to an IEP that lasts for a couple of months, and then we're going to meet and develop a whole year. But they can't go more than a year. That's the important thing to know, is we can never write them for more than one calendar year at a time. So we have to review them at least annually, and that's most of our students. We have that one meeting. But we also have students that we've had 10 in the last 2 months, right? I mean, things like that happen as well. It also says in the law that we have to report progress to parents at least as often as we give progress on grades for all kids. So if you're on a 9-week system, we report on your goals and how you're progressing towards goals on a 9-week span. If you're on trimesters and that's the only time you give out grades, that's what we do for progress. We have to at least keep up with what we're doing for everybody else. Now, I think Marcy kind of mentioned earlier that is when we give that to parents. What that doesn't mean is that I should have one data point at the end of that 9 weeks and say, here's what it is. I mean, we know that we need multiple data points in order to make any judgment about a trend, a pattern, anything that's going on with a student. So we're collecting along the way. I just have to make sure that I get all my data entered into the system so that a parent can get that progress report at least as often as report cards. All right, anybody get move-in students? Yeah, this is the season right now. You're probably already getting calls. Okay, important things to know about move-ins. Number one, make sure all of your building administrators know that you never say, oh, is it Ami? Ami, great to have you. You have an IEP? You come back in about 15 days when I've gotten that form from Illinois, and we'll get ready for you. We enroll on day one, just like we would for any student without a disability. Then we work our tails off to try and get the IEP information, and sometimes it doesn't happen, right? Sometimes, I remember during like Hurricane Katrina time, I remember people getting students who had come up from Louisiana that said, I can't get any records. Schools aren't in. Records are washed away, right? We go with the best we can. We ask the parent, tell me, what was your child's day like, right? And then we start from scratch. We gather our own data and start from scratch. But we bring the kid in and we try to match up what we think we know about what their program is from day one. And then within 10 instructional days, we have to have a move-in conference to figure out, is this an IEP that we have in front of us that we say, ooh, this looks great, we'll just put it into our system and roll with it, or do we need to make some changes? We also sometimes will have students that come in from another state that have different rules.
Like Iowa.
Yes, Iowa is a non-categorical state, and sometimes we have to say, okay, we'll get that reevaluation started, right? And we get a permission sign because we just do the best we can until we have more information to change it. So it's not always easy, but the key is we don't break in service. We get them in the door, even if we have to scramble, you know? I get a kid who has a one-on-one aide, and I'm like, but I don't have one hired for this kid, right? We find one. We find somebody in our system who can work with this kid until we can get the process where they need to be. Yeah, it's hard. Sometimes we also get this, right? The kid's in the middle of an evaluation and they move in. I've gotten kids who've moved in that have 5 days left on their timeline and the evaluation wasn't started yet. I also have kids who move in that have had everything done, but they just haven't had a chance to conference it in the old school. Things like that happen too. You do your best to work with the sending school. Hopefully they were kind enough to wrap up everything that they could and send it to you, but it doesn't always happen that way. So we have to try and get it done, but there are also times where we have to negotiate a new timeline. Now, it's kind of ambiguous in Article 7 that we've got to agree on a new timeline, and it doesn't say this, but the spirit of it is that it can't be 6 months from now. It still has to be 50 school days or less. And if part of it's already done, we want it to be or less, but you also want to make sure that this kid has a chance to acclimate to a new school, that new people have a chance to get to know the student, because they can't fill out rating scales on the 3rd day that they've known a student if that hasn't been done. So there's a lot of things to consider, but you have to work that out with the parent and be very transparent with them about, I know you started on this timeline, we want to make sure we're doing what's right for your child. So the big thing for you all that are administrators, and I know not all of you in here are administrators, you got to know these timelines so you can support them. You've got to know them so that you can stay on top of them, because if I'm your school psychologist and I miss a timeline, yeah, it looks bad for me, but it's the school and the school district that gets dinged. It's not my name that shows up on anything. I'm going to catch heck from my supervisor, but but ultimately, the public agency is the one that's going to have to write a corrective action plan, or whatever has to happen. Make sure that we have procedures and processes in place, and we'll talk later on this afternoon about what are the required policies, procedures that are part of Article 7. But there are a lot of things that aren't required, that if you keep having trouble with them, you need procedures, right? That's why we write manuals on how we do things, because we have to make sure that we're following all those. And then making sure that everyone's got their responsibilities kind of mapped out, because it is different in every building that you're in, who's responsible for what. There are some places that the teacher of record might have a responsibility, versus I've been in a lot of schools where with initial referrals, it may be the school counselor in the building that gets that process rolling. It just really depends on your system. So you've got to think about what are your procedures, so if you get a new employee tomorrow, they can look at those procedures and say, oh, that's not how I'm used to doing it, but I can do it because it's all mapped out.
So thanks for hanging out with us this morning. Angie didn't run you off, so we're in good shape there. We're going to talk a bit more about timelines with implementing an IEP. There's some time involved with that, and we'll get into some detail into that process here shortly. Just in way of introductions, my name is Matt, by the way. I'm not just a tech support person, also talking about special ed, so I get to do a little bit of both today. We'll see. I know I can do the tech support part. We'll see if I can do the rest. So we're going to talk about implementing the IEP, because after we've held the case conference, what happens next? How does that process continue? So one of the things that, and we'll talk a little bit more detail, a lot on this slide here, but it has to do with implementation of an IEP after we've held the conference. So what happens next once things happen? So the first thing, and Angie talked about 2 different really categories in this process. The first is that initial. So that the initial process that once the parent needs, so we have a little bit of time here, but once the parent has signed that consent, we have a few days to provide that documentation to parents. So it's not necessarily for us to, well, here's the thing. Usually when we go through this process, we're signing off an initial IEP, we want to be ready to implement that document. So when the parent has signed their consent, we might need a little bit of time to get things ready to go, but once we have that in place, we want to make sure we're ready to hit the ground running with that process. We don't want to make anybody wait. We just signed that IEP. We want to make sure it's implemented as we've written and really is what we've agreed upon too. So not just necessarily what's written on the page, but what also the intent has to go with that too. That's kind of one of those pieces there. So no later than 10 instructional days after the parent consent to the student's initial IEP is received. So the services must be provided by that time. So once they've signed off on those pieces. This one's interesting. The 11th instructional day has to do with if the student's already eligible. So this is an annual case review, or if we're revising the IEP, when must all these things be done? So this is a little bit different. Like Angie was talking about, for the initial IEP, the parent has a lot of control over when this IEP, whether or not it's even implemented. They still have a lot of power within the process. As we mentioned, that they can revoke consent at any time. They can pull, but revoking consent has its own consequences as far as protections with special education. But when we have a student that's been eligible with us, the second part comes into play. So we've completed the case conference. Keep in mind, this timeline doesn't necessarily begin at the day of that conference. It's when the parent is provided written notice. So the written notice is the IEP. So the completed IEP with all those documentations, the final version shared with the parent, that's when our timeline begins. So if you have a conference and you say something like, I'm not going to say this is advisable, but something that happens is we didn't complete the IEP, we got to finish up writing the IEP, we put the notes in place, all those kind of things. When the parent receives that, that's when your those instructional days begin. So it's not just when the meeting's over. So keep those kind of things in mind. So the couple things that happen, one of the issues sometimes gets a little bit confusing in our IEP, well, I don't want to get into the IEP system stuff, but when we have a case conference, if the parent chooses to sign, if we have an annual case review, it's a notice of implementation that appears there. So it's a little different than just the implementation of an initial IEP. The notice of implementation notifies the parent of their rights within that moment and lets them know that the IEP is going to be implemented on the 11th instructional day after they've received that written notice. If they sign on that page, what that's actually doing is waiving that timeline. So that means they want to implement right now. So the notice of implementation is just letting parents know the timelines involved, some of their rights involved there. So we talked a little bit about that. You can see here it talks about the 3 options parents have to challenge an IEP, especially in this situation. They can ask for a meeting, ask for mediation, ask for due process, and there's a whole sections of Article 7 that involve in those kind of pieces. I know lots of nighttime reading ahead of you if you want to know more about those kind of pieces there. But so it's important that we understand the differences. If it's an initial, once a parent has signed that, we need to implement the IEP as soon as possible, at least within those 10 instructional days. If it's an annual or revised IEP, then we have it's a little different process. And the notice of implementation shares information. If the parent signs that notice again, it waives those, what it does is waives that waiting period. So now we must implement it immediately. So there's a lot of things going on with that process. The assumption is something's already going on with this student, so we might just have to slightly adjust things so we're ready to roll with whatever we decided in that case conference. But of course there could be some changes there too. Because so the big change here, I'm going to go back in history. I'm almost about there I remember the whole process Angie was talking about with the 3-year reevaluations, but we also used to have every IEP signed by parents before we could implement anything. So whether it was an initial or revised IEP, an annual, we couldn't do anything until we had that signature. And that became problematic when we had trouble tracking down parents, and we had an IEP we all agreed upon, but for whatever reason we couldn't get that signature. So we were stuck in a stay put kind of situation where we just had to keep following the old IEP until we could finally track down the signature. So this process was kind of put in place to help us with that. Like we know we agreed upon this outcome. We're ready to go. We're ready to roll with this IEP. Let's go. And this helps that if the student's already eligible, helps us continue serving the student, especially if we made adjustments to the IEP. We don't have to wait until it's signed again for that process. And again, as far as things go, it gets a little sticky sometimes when we have some disagreements within case conferences, or if we're not exactly on the same page with pieces go. And I always offer, we have the 3 pretty significant options there. We can request another or facilitate a meeting. We can look for mediation and due process. If the parents want to talk, let's talk. Let's hold a meeting. Let's discuss these things. It doesn't necessarily have to be another formal meeting, at least to have the discussion. But if we're going to make decisions, we need to bring in the team and help us all with those pieces. So there's always opportunities to discuss. There's the difficulty with when we go down these pathways to an official response is the relationship, because we're going to talk about that a little bit with relationships in case conferences. But once we get into mediation and due process, those relationships get challenging, even more so. Even if it's already challenging, it sometimes breaks that communication. And we always, if we want to serve students best, communication's where it starts. If that ever breaks down, then it becomes a real challenge for us to continue. So one of the big things this is one of the things, it's really succinct, and if you've read through Article 7 enough times, there's very few places where a line just stands out by itself. And this is one of them. If you ever have I know everybody enjoys reading through those documents like I do, but if you ever read through it, it says that IEP must be implemented as written. So what does that mean? So think about that just for a few seconds. If you think about it seems pretty obvious, but it's important to it's important to understand those things. So it's important that our whole team knows what this IEP says, so that we're not missing anything when we go. Because one thing we don't want to have is a missing component. Like, they're supposed to get this service 3 times a week. Who's been doing that? Those kind of, and we're going to talk about responsibilities and fidelity here shortly. But so and I think it's interesting too. There's other places where it's worded a little bit differently, not just as written, but what has been agreed upon. So that's in what's supposed to be in writing, but it also goes to not just the line by line piece, but the spirit of what you've agreed upon too. So just going through, thinking through as we look at the IEP, what is this going to mean? Who needs to know about it? How do we make sure this is implemented as it is written? And if it's written in a way that we can't implement it, that's our first clue to revise an IEP. Like, hey, we can't do that. Now, you have to be really careful with how you phrase those kind of things. Like, we understand the student's need. Here's the way we propose we meet that need. You don't want to go to a conference or a meeting and say, we can't do that. We don't get to say that. We don't get to say we don't have the people, we don't have the money, we don't have the resources. We have to think about a creative way to resolve this problem. How are we going to resolve this issue? What are we going to do about the student's needs? Because that's what drives this whole thing. We don't drive this ship. The student's needs do. So we have to go wherever it's going. And sometimes you have to be really careful when we start putting barriers around those processes, because we can get into things like predetermination and some issues like that. So we have to be really thoughtful. As not every student's the same. I've had that conversation plenty of times. Well, I've served students with learning disabilities, so pretty much all their IEPs look the same and they get the same services. Like, well, that's not the best idea. We have to back off a little bit. I'm saying that pretty mildly, but not a good idea to kind of shoehorn kids into a program that's not built just for them. So it's individualized program. It's not a group program. That's what MTSS is a group, starts off with a group programming. Special ed is about an individual. So that can be a little challenging. So that's a short sentence, but it carries a lot of meaning there. So just something that carries a lot of responsibility, not just for as an administrator, but every level of people that work and serve that student throughout the school day. How do we serve them? How do we support them? Even into, the folks that work in the cafeterias and the hallways, the janitors, pieces like making sure that the folks that encounter your students know how to do that. Because the last thing we want is a chance encounter in a hallway escalating a student out of control. So if we can help alleviate that or minimize it, we have those conversations. So making sure we're all on the same page and it's all clear. And that's step, and we'll get into behavior and pieces later on today. So who's responsible for this after all? Who do I go point fingers to when I want to say it's your fault? It mainly really resides on the teacher of record. The teacher of record has a lot of responsibilities here in this process, making sure that, well, first of all, as the teacher of record, you have to be licensed in that area. So it was an interesting, when I was teaching, that was something that happened with me sometimes. The teacher of record would be someone else with a behavior licensure, which I didn't have at the time, but I would be serving that student most of the day. So there's teachers of record, teachers of service. The teacher of record is still responsible for making sure that IEP is implemented with those different folks. So if you have related services, if you have other services that are running with that student, essentially you need to make sure those things are happening, because it's going to come back to you in the long run. So it's important that the teacher of record is sure about those pieces. So, and then I guess if we go a step up from that, the administrators are responsible then to make sure the resources are there so that my staff can do their job. So if the IEP, there's a section of your IEP that asks about instruction and support for your staff in the building, you need to make sure your staff in the building, if you have students with autism, for example, you have some training that goes along with that so they know what to do. If you have a behavior plan, does your staff in the gen ed setting know how their role in implementing that behavior plan? Because most of our students are going to spend most of their time in the general education setting, so we need to spend a lot of time making sure everyone knows their role to play, whether it's in the behavior plan or in the IEP in general. Look at the accommodations, what things need to be modified, how does this student learn best, how do we help, what kind of grouping do they need? Do they need different kinds of seating or support in that classroom? Making sure the resources are there so that professional development can continue if need be, and the document and even the hardware and software kids need to get around the school day is in place so that we can move along. So that's not a barrier to that student's instruction. As the last thing we want to be as a teacher or administrator is a barrier to a student's progress. If anything, we want to facilitate their progress. I mean, that's our goal, is to facilitate their progress, to help them grow. We want to everything we can out of their way so they can do that. Okay, I guess I just said that stuff. I jumped ahead of myself a little bit on these but thinking ahead, you know, planning as an administrator, what do we need to do? What do we need to do to make sure that these IEPs are in place? Like, we're talking about roles of the case conference here shortly. You know, being aware of what programs you have in place, being aware of what your students are, what's going on with your classroom, with your students, so that we can anticipate problems and anticipate needs and build solutions before the problem arises. You know, because if we have a problem now, something that we're going to have to wait until we figure it out. So ideally, we can anticipate that things are going to happen. Of course, things are going to get in the way and going to slow us down occasionally. But if we can anticipate those issues, I think that can help us a lot as we go through this. So, when you think of the word fidelity, this is one of those where I was thinking back there as we were getting ready for this, that fidelity is one of those words that we hear constantly in education now. That usually apply to teachers, usually like, hey, you're not doing what you're supposed to kind of thing, is kind of a gotcha kind of situation where, oh, did you implement that with fidelity, that kind of thing. So I don't want to, that word comes with a lot of baggage, so I want to be careful in using it because that's one of those pieces. But the idea is, faithfulness is what that is, being faithful to the documentation, being faithful to the instructions, so that are we implementing this as it's written, as it's said? Are we being true to that piece as we're going through that? I've run in those situations occasionally where it's just interesting when you start talking teacher to teacher sometimes when you're not an administrator just coming in to help, and they'll tell you things they probably shouldn't. You know, occasionally, like, well, this kid's got 15 goals. I figured I'm just going to implement the first 5. Like, oh, well, that's a bit problematic. Yeah, 15 goals, that's what you took out of that 15 goals. Yeah, the 15, I was reading some different cases, and that can be problematic when you have that many things you're trying to keep track of. But it's just important that we are on the same spot. We're looking at implementing these things faithfully so that we're going to see. And we have to keep good information as we're going through it. So as we're implementing these things fully, we don't want that to be the stopping point there, because sometimes we have those different strategies, different interventions that we've all learned about that they tell you how to implement those pieces. They tell us what we're supposed to do, how we're supposed to work with the students, and if we fail on those pieces, then the data we collect isn't reliable. So that's one of the pieces, that's why we talk about fidelity so much, is that, you know, like curriculum-based assessments, there's little step-by-step guides on how to implement those different pieces. There's scripts on what we should say to introduce those things. And the reason for those is to keep it consistent so we can trust the information. If we change it up, if we don't feel like doing it that day, then that information we're gathering might be skewed in some way, shape, or form. So all the information we collect, anything that's norm referenced or things like that, are comparative, and we're doing exactly the same thing, exact same way. Just like their state assessments, you get a script. If you're a proctor for any kind of assessment, and here's what you say these words, then don't say anything else. You don't get to help, you don't get to add anything else to what's being said, here's what you say. So that's fidelity, just being faithful to that script. Now, I don't think your day should be scripted, but when we want to be consistent in those pieces to make sure we're following through. And again, as an administrator, for those of you that are administrators, what training and resources are necessary for this to happen? If something different is happening in every classroom around the same event, then maybe that's something we need to talk about. You know, there's all kinds of pieces. If we treat behavior differently in every classroom, we're going to have behavior occur differently in every space. So we think about how we treat it. How do we talk about it? How do we talk about trauma? How do we talk about the students that we have in our buildings and what services we have to provide for them? So fidelity is important. It's not enough just to talk about it. We have to actually do it as it's written. So, all right. So when we talk about fidelity, it's broken down into some different categories. And this comes from, I think, Intensive Intervention, National Center for Intensive Intervention, I think is where this comes from. And I think it's one of the resources they have. They have a whole host of resources around fidelity. So that's a neat place. And I think that link is in our Padlet also. It's one of those, if you have never, anybody familiar with the National Center for Intensive Intervention? So, yeah. All those things you want to have done for you, they're already done. National Center for Intensive Intervention. And it's linked.
The website is intensiveintervention.org.
Yep, it's in the Padlet. I think it's linked somewhere in our presentation later too. So, yeah, it's worth your time. There's a few places like that. Iris Center is another place that's like that. And there's a few others that are, if you have those in your back pocket, you're going to have a lot of good information there. So we talk about student engagement, fidelity, making sure that how involved is the student in the activity, because we're going to produce something, if we're going to intervene, if we're going to teach, students have to be engaged. That's one of those kind of markers as we look through student progress and student development, that student engagement is key. If students are sitting back not caring about what's going on, they're not learning. So how do we make that happen? Specificity, so I got to use my college words today, so I appreciate that, but specificity, making sure the program is designed for that student. It's just not a generic thing that everybody fits into. We have programs for that. That's public education is more or less a generic program. We can differentiate within that piece, of course, but special education is designed for a specific student. This one named on that IEP is who this is designed for. We can look at quality of delivery. So as an administrator, again, do we have the support? So is it just because this person isn't familiar with this process, they don't understand this intervention, is that where we're failing? These are all really describing barriers to student growth and progress. So implementation, the first one. Specific program quality delivery, exposure, duration. This is something that's in our IEPs. Is their service long enough? Is this enough time? Or is it too much time? We only need 10 minutes for this, why do we have 50? You know, we're only going to be in this classroom for 10 minutes, that's part of the IEP. Or, hey, 15 minutes is not enough time for this student, let's add more to it. And we have to have a conference to discuss those kind of changes, but that's something we can discuss as part of fidelity too. And adherence, I like this one, delivery consistent across educators. So One of the things that we talk about sometimes when you go into discussions around MTSS, the different tiers, is being consistent in the language across those different tiers. So if I instruct someone in tier 3, the language I use is repeated throughout. So we're using the same words to describe the same things, so it's consistent. You get those reinforcements. We get this a lot of times with speech pathologists when they work with a classroom. We're talking about language, we're talking about grammar. Let's use the same language. Let's use the same words. We're going to describe things the same way. Behavior can be that way. We want to use the same process, the same idea, the same consistent language throughout all the folks who work with that student, so we don't have any, the student doesn't get confused within that process. Because if I say one thing and Elisa says something else, even though we're describing the same behavior or activity, kids get confused and kind of think they're different things completely. So we be consistent within that process. And that takes communication. We have to internally communicate to make sure we are consistent in how we're dealing with the students' behavior, their activities, their instruction, so that we're all on the same page. Not that we all need to be uniform or conform together, but we all have to, let's talk about things the same way.
Can I add to that a little bit, Matt?
I'm sorry?
Can I add something to that?
Sure.
I think it's really important to know too that our special ed teachers don't do it all.
Yeah.
Right? They only typically get students a teeny part of the day. And
Right.
so adherence is also talking about what a student needs. Yes, they may get it with me in my room or in the classroom, wherever, but they need to get it throughout the day, which means that our gen ed teachers, our special ed, or our special teachers, whether it's a gym class, art class, that everybody's working together and on the same page, and that program is really happening 24/7 when a student is with us.
Yeah, I think that's really important. And it goes to an earlier point that the kids that we serve, most of them are in the gen ed classroom 80% or more of the day. So it's important we are all talking the same talk, walking the same walk, so the kids can see that we're all on the same team, so we're supporting the students that way. And I guess it's also important with adherence for an administrator to check in on those kind of things. So if we talk about classroom rules being consistent across our school building, is that actually happening? Are we going through this just as you do your walkthroughs and you do your observations with the teachers? That's this is part of that piece. Is this actually what's happening in this classroom, formally and informally? Is this what's occurring? So we want to make sure that we're being consistent. We want to ensure that that's what students are getting. So that's the implementation piece of that. Any questions, concerns as we're going, before I jump into just the roles within an IEP meeting? I know it is riveting and exciting stuff to talk through all these things. But as far as the implementation piece, the big ideas are be faithful to what you've written and agreed upon. And if and keep that communication stream going between yourselves and the parent and those entities and within the school to make sure we're on the same page as much as we can. Yes, ma'am.
Okay, yes. So after the PACE conference.
Right.
And the IEP is set to be delivered, you want it on the day that the meeting is held, and if that's so, and if there's other pieces that are not finalized within that day, is there an extension time period, or do they get it's a watermark copy
Okay.
of the IEP
So,
on the day of the service, on the day of the meeting?
so let me see if I can capture all what you said, and we'll see if I got it. So one of the things we're talking about is when things aren't necessarily finalized on the day of, and when's the timeline start for, and what parents get, because the best we can do at that point is give them a draft IEP. So I'm going to step into a parent role, and to me, if I'm a parent, I wouldn't like that at all. Because if you're still working on the IEP, I want to see the final document that I'm going to agree upon. Is that I don't know, Angie stood up, so she's got something to say.
Always.
Go ahead.
So one of the things from the legal team at the Department of Education, they've been very clear in some of the guidance they've given to us that a draft IEP is intended to have at the meeting, right?
Yeah.
If you do some stuff, you draft some goals, you got a little bit put into place, you can print out that draft IEP, and it's kind of a guidance, a starting point for the meeting. obviously it's not done, and obviously everything in there is subject to change. After that, I would not give a copy until it's finalized. And they say a draft is not something that you should send home after a meeting and say, look it over. You got any changes to recommend? You send them back my way. No. The decisions happen with the right people in that meeting. Now you have 10 business, this is where the days switch, 10 business days from the day you have that meeting to get that finalized IEP to the parent, which means if I meet the day before Christmas break starts, clock's still ticking. I got
Business
10
days.
banking days basically to get it together and to get that sent home
Right.
for the parent to then have their potential options of disagreeing formally with the IEP. And then on that 11th day after they receive it, then it just goes into place for a subsequent IEP. But I wouldn't use the draft. I would, if you have to use your window, great. That's okay. You've got that 10 business day window. But if you think about, I've got a behavior kid that I need to make some changes tomorrow, I'm probably going to sit there and get it ready and give the finalized copy and see if I can get a signature. Because if I wait 10 business days and then the parent waits 10 instructional days, heck, a month has gone by and I have not made that change to the kid's program.
Okay. So I don't know if that gets to where you're going, but I know that happens a lot when we get to the end of a conference and we got all these people and we got to get all their information into this. Or someone took notes separately. All those kind of things have to be in there. And I would say, if that's the case, there's really no problem with giving parents copies of the things you're going to put in there, so they have that information also. It's not a secret. Legally they can ask for copies of all those things anyway. So they can, honestly, parents, I've read through cases where, the little doodles you're writing in your notepad get pulled into evidence. So just be thoughtful about, so if you're good at drawing caricatures, you probably don't want those to be part of the register. So just be thoughtful about that as you're taking notes. And that's not a bad thing to think. I know we'll talk about parent involvement and pieces like that too, but not a bad idea to think about it in a case conference when you're taking notes. Anyone at the meeting, parent-friendly be the thought. Be respectful as you're taking those notes. Be respectful. You obviously are going to be respectful in your speech, but be respectful in your writing. And remember, in emails too. As I was reading through some case law not too long ago, and boy, that's something. When you get to read through, like the email you thought that no one was going to read, is right there. Would you please read this to the court? Would you like to have that situation happen to you? That's the kind of thing. Now, not to be a fear monger and say, hey, you need to be afraid of these things, but you need to protect yourself. Be smart as you're going through the process. And we're never going to get less litigious as a group, I don't think. So as a society, so I think it's important you're careful as you're taking notes, as you're conversing with parents. Be very aware of, and that's really why we're talking about this stuff today, is to make you aware of the rules so that you can count your speech appropriately, and you're aware of what can happen if you don't. So leading IEP meetings, I'm going to talk about case conference procedures. The first thing I like to talk about is just the things that have nothing to do with the case conference. They're not legal pieces, they're just etiquette as we're going through and greeting parents. I have been this is one of my favorite stories because it's true and crazy. Case conferences I used to go to a long time ago, we had an occupational therapist that while her part was not being discussed, she'd be knitting sweaters. So she had her knitting needles going, and at the end of case conference season, because back in that day we had all our case conferences in the spring, so she was knitting scarves for everybody, and she had one for everybody by the end of the year. And, I'm like, great, thanks for your input. But those are the kind of, be engaged, be part of the meeting, because even if your part's not being discussed, your experience with the student's still important. You're going to be working with that student, and that's one of the things for general education teachers. We need to remind them that you're spending most of the time of the day with a student. Your input, not just their grades and their scores, but what do you know about the student? You know more about them day to day than most people in the room other than their parents. So let's bring that to the table. I know it's not always possible, but don't leave early. If, as an administrator, you can't always do that, be engaged, turn off your phone, have a backup plan for emergencies so you don't get called out of the meeting, and we're going to talk about later shortly, as that public agency representative, it's important that you're there. You're making some important decisions right there, and if you miss part of the discussion, you're going to miss out on some of the information and may not make the decision you'd hope for. So, and I've also been in the meeting where an administrator walks in and, well, who are we talking about today? And who is this? Tell me a little bit about, right before the meeting begins, tell me a little bit about him. Oh, that's okay. And they're supposed to be the public agency representative and not really informed. So be informed. Angie did a really nice job talking about the notice of procedural safeguards. There's also something called Navigating the Course that can be helpful. That's I think it's still on the DOE's website, which is supposed to be a parent-friendly version of that document. It's not really. It's helpful, but it's still a big document. There's still a lot of information, so it still could take your expertise to summarize that for the situation. So the elevator speech that Angie was talking about, not a bad idea to step back and practice that ahead of time so you know what you're going to say. This conference is going to talk about these things. It also, not only does it show your understanding of the procedural safeguards, but it also illustrates your understanding of the student and what's about to happen in that meeting. So you've done your homework, is what that illustrates when you walk in the room. So I thought that was really important. This is a big thing. We talked about the students' needs driving the ship, and that's really the idea here. The students' needs dictate the outcome of this meeting. A lot of times we have a discussion when we're at a case conference and before or after where administrative convenience sometimes comes into the conversation. Well, I don't, that won't fit in my schedule, or that we don't have time for that during the day, or that's not the way I like to do things. Well, we have to figure out how we're going to solve the problem of this student's need. What does it look like? What's the solution? We have to come up with the best option we have, and that's what the IEP is all about. That's what the IEP defines, that free and appropriate public education, that FAPE that we talk about. That's what it is. It's general education plus the IEP equals FAPE. So here we go. Oh boy. So I'm not going to go through these line by line. I know you guys would really enjoy having me read through this. But this is right out of Article 7. These are the components required of an IEP. So the good thing that we have going for us is we have an IEP system that follows the guidelines, that has the information in there. So the IEP system, while it's not perfect, will help you be compliant. So it'll help you make sure all these pieces are done. So make sure, take the time to complete those pieces and update them. If this information in the box A is the same from 1st grade to 8th grade, then we might have a little bit of a problem. So look through the IEP. One of the drawbacks of an electronic document of any kind, especially like the one we have, is everything's filled in. Once we filled in the IEP, it stays that way until we act upon it. So it's a nice thing to have because we just have to update it. But I've read too many IEPs where the present levels are consistent for 3 or 4 years, and the goals haven't changed much. I've also seen the situations where, it's Johnny's IEP, but it says Susie will in the goal. That kind of stuff comes up. It's a little cringe. My kids will. It's a little cringy. My kids hate it when I say that stuff, but cringeworthy. But it's one of those things, oh, I can't believe that happened, but it does. You have a lot of IEPs to complete. You don't have a lot of time to do it. So everyone's looking for a fast way to get things done. The best idea is to go slow or to go fast. Slow it down. Make sure everything's right, accurate for that student. It's going to save you a whole lot of problems later on. Because that, again, if you do something like that, even if I know this is a touchy piece and I don't want to get too deep, but even being aware of gender and those kind of pronouns and pieces like that, big deal right now. Be aware of it as you go through the process, as you're developing the IEP. Know what you're talking about, because that you don't want something that's not necessarily relevant to their IEP services to take down your whole meeting. So just be thoughtful, and that's part of the etiquette piece. It doesn't matter if you agree or not, it's what is going to get us through the day. So those are all the components of an IEP, and I know you'd love, I'll leave them in there so you can read those pieces as we go through. We're going to talk about some of the highlights here shortly. Yes, ma'am.
Are we going to go over what the criteria for the placement of, students' need for extended school year services?
We can talk a little bit about that. Criteria for extended school year services. I'm going to let Angie field that one because she's our resident extended school year expert. And
Is anybody an
know.
expert on that?
That's the
I
thing.
mean, really. There actually is a guide
Yes.
that I think InSource and the Department of Ed worked on years ago that it's a very extended process of trying to figure it out. I'm going to shrink it down to have you think as simply as you can about extended school year. Number one, consider it every year, right? Don't just say, well, your child doesn't have the type of disability that would need extended school year. There's no criteria about your disability or the category. The bottom line is, do we see regression over breaks? Different than everybody has, right? We know summer people come back and they've taken a few steps back. Every kid is like that. But when you get a kid who you go on a 2-week break for, spring break or whatever, and they come back and you're like, holy cow, what happened? Because I needed consistent therapy, I needed consistent, behavior, whatever it is. That's a clue that extended school year might be appropriate. Or there are some times where it's not always summer, right? Sometimes extended school year is just extended beyond the regular school day. It can be extended across breaks. But you sometimes have a point to where I just got to this critical point in a skill and suddenly the school year's over and you're like, we need to keep rolling with that. That's my simplified version. It's always a potential option for any student. It usually is something that, unless it's critical like that, most parents don't want it. Parents want a summer break for their kids too.
kids do too.
Yeah, oh, absolutely.
Well-
But it's definitely always something to consider.
One of my takeaways from what Angie just said is relying on information and data. It's not about what I think or feel, it's what I know and can prove. So I can show you the regression happens. I can show you that this is what's going on. I can show you we're at a critical juncture where the student needs this continued support. Having that data to support your decisions. I was at a conference not too long ago where that was exactly the conversation. The parent was asking for extended school year, and the school was saying, we don't see the data. We don't have the support for that. We can't allocate that. Well, they didn't talk about it this way, but we can't allocate resources for that. We don't have data to say this is going to happen. And so it was a very interesting conversation, but it was important the school had that information. So keep that in mind as you're having those ESY. Really, any discussion, it's less about what we think and feel, but what we can show and prove. We want to have the information to back that up. If we start to think and feel something's happening with a student, that should be our clue. This isn't on the thing, but that should be our clue to start collecting information. If I'm thinking something's going on, start looking around for how data I can collect so when the conference comes around or the meeting comes up, I have something I can rely on that's going to show, here's what I'm saying. Here's what I felt was right. We're on this trajectory for the wrong thing.
Gail mentioned that that's part of the reason why progress monitoring on a regular basis is so important too. So you do have that data.
Yeah.
I just wanted to point out one more thing, that extended school year is not the same as summer school. If we offer summer school, that's great. And this kid, if they want to participate in that, that's great. Extended school year is specially designed instruction that needs to happen
Right.
beyond the school year, the school day, whatever.
And with summer school, their special ed rights still continue. So that's important to keep that in mind too. If the kid goes to summer PE or summer PE is what my kids went to, they still need to receive whatever support services they would for the typical school year. So don't let that fall. So sample agenda. This is something that we talk about. I know I've been involved in a few of these. I know we have a lot more experience in the room around facilitated IEPs, but this is something that we rely on to help through case conferences. So one thing to keep in mind, if you're going to use an agenda, use it all the time. Make sure it's something that's in place for every meeting, not just those special ones where you know are going to be problematic, because eventually someone's going to figure that out and say, oh, why I have an agenda but my friend doesn't, what's going on? Well, because you're a big problem, that's why. You don't get to say that, and you never should. But it's something to keep in mind. It does a couple things. It keeps you on point and on task with your meetings, so you can say, here's what we have to talk about first, and you can explain why. Part of it has to do with the way Article 7 is laid out. Until we talk about the student first and develop a profile around them, talk about their eligibility before we talk about services and placement and those kind of things. We have to know all we can about an individual before we can decide what they need and where they need it. So we have to think about those kind of things. That's why it's shaped the way it is. So that can be really helpful in keeping us in line, because sometimes you go to the first thing people want to talk about when you come into a meeting is, hey, that doesn't work in my classroom. I think this student needs to be here. Or the parents are concerned, well, I think this program would be better. Well, we're going to follow the data again. Here's the information we've got so far. Now, if you don't have the data, you're in a tough spot, because now it's just my opinion against your opinion. But we should have the information. Sorry, I'm hitting the microphone, so Dale's going to get thunder. But we should have the information to back up our decisions. Here's what I see, and make it in a way that parents can understand. We're not trying to trick anybody. We're not trying to pull one over on any parent, student, or otherwise. Show it. Here it is. Here's what we're doing. Here's what has been successful. Here's what's not been successful. Here's what proposed as the next thing. So that's the big idea with one big idea with IEPs and case conferences is an IEP really is an educated guess. It's a hypothesis for a student. So, but if we want to have a good hypothesis, we have to have good information first. So the more information we have, the better information we have, the better program plan, the better educated guess we can put in place for a student. Now my dad was a science teacher for years, so that's part of the scientific method. So that's just one of those things that is ingrained for me from, I don't know, I grew up in classrooms cleaning, anyway. I still can remember the sound and smell of the mimeograph machine. And half of you don't know what I'm talking about, but the that thing. Yeah, all right, there you go. That's a little bit of how old I am. So it's always important to introduce everybody. I think and this part of the etiquette piece is, and I'm sure all you guys do this, greet parents when at the door. Don't make them walk down a dark hallway to find you. And one of the things I remember doing this, I don't know, you guys have I'm sure everyone in this room has been in an interview where you walk in a room and all of a sudden it gets quiet, and then you get nervous, like, well, they were just talking about me, I know it. And they probably weren't, but that's what parents feel when they come into a room too. So just be thoughtful about those kind of things. Those creature comforts, let's try not to use the preschool table and chairs if we can help it. That I always had those. You get the nice kidney-shaped table, and I'm this far off the ground, and like, I'm going to be here for a while. After you guys leave the room, I'll get up. But those kind of things are just not unwritten rules, kind of really, but being thoughtful about that, and even the idea when folks come into a room, having just that here, we're going to sit on this side of the table, you sit there, and you already made up sides already. Let's bring folks into, treat folks the way we want them to feel. So that as you come into the meeting, the parents' input is as valuable as anyone else's, and probably more so than most people at the table. So it's important we treat them that way from the get-go. And that's going to go a long way. Those little things can help a lot. So norms or ground rules, I know we had the conversation earlier about this a bit. When the parent brings someone in, this can be helpful in us to guide us down the pathway. So when we talk about, we're going to have one person speak at a time, respect each other's opinions, those kind of things, be timely. Those are the kind of pieces we can have for norms that we're going to set up in all of our meeting rooms. So we're going to follow those pieces all the time. And we've got some sample ones we can share, I'm sure. I know this is something with the FIPs, we make sure we share every single time. Like, here's a facilitated IEP meeting. And sorry, I think catch me on my shorthand. All right. But the idea is we want to stay on topic. So if someone floats off topic, we have a little parking lot or somewhere we can write that down for later. We don't need to talk about that right now because it's not relevant. I know you need the answer. We'll talk about it later. And just make sure you do talk about it later, because that's the issue there, is you write it on eventually. So one of the things I used to have when I was teaching is a tattle box. You guys ever heard of that? The kids were always, it's elementary at school, so they like to tattle on each other. So I had a little box. You write down your tattle, put it in the box. Don't tell me. I'll check them at the end. I did check them at the end of the day, but not everybody. I had other teachers that just threw them out every single day or just put, so make sure you read them. Make sure you follow through on those pieces, or eventually your integrity is going to be questioned as we're going through it. So sample agenda doesn't have to be as extensive as this piece, and it may vary based on the meeting, but it's important to have one to follow. And even sometimes as administrator, I always talk about this, you don't necessarily want folks to have a script to follow, but you might have some talking points. Here's what I want you to talk about here. You make sure, or some sentence starters within those pieces. I want to make sure my meetings are relatively consistent. They don't have to be uniform, but we want to consistently cover these things. So make sure, and that's part of your onboarding as you start your school year. How do we want our conferences to run? So, well, as we're going through this process, before I get into the next roles piece, the outcome of an IEP by itself is a definition of a free and appropriate public education for that individual. So you're defining FAPE for that student. So it's important. Sometimes you have to draw the line. This is one of those uncomfortable pieces where here's what we've determined to be a free and appropriate public education, or I'll just say FAPE from now on because I'm stumbling over that word. But here's what we as a public agency have determined is FAPE. Here's what it is. You don't want to get into that take it or leave it moment kind of thing, because that's not really where you want to be. But sometimes you have to go there and just say, here's what it is, and this is where we're going to land. And that might lead you into those due process or mediation kind of pieces also, but you have to be thoughtful about that. It's not, the idea for a case conference is not, it's not a vote. I remember having been in case conferences when I started out where everybody got to vote on the IEP. I don't know if anyone's had that conversation, but it's a consensus is what you're searching for. So that means you can live with it. That's what we're trying. Everyone can live with the outcome. It might not be your favorite thing, but you can live with the outcome. So you have to be kind of careful with that, but that's what we're trying to get to. And the leader of that process from the school's perspective is usually that public agency representative. They're the ones who get to say, have the final, I don't know about final say, but they're the ones that present FAPE to the parents for them to decide upon. Okay, so this one is always a fun one. So excusal, gosh, I just read through a couple things on this one. I always encounter issues with this piece, but excusal is important. Looking at my time, getting close here. So maybe I'll go through this one and the next one. We'll take a break. So excusal is for these key members of the meeting. So prior written consent's required for these people to be excused. Well, the way Article 7 spells it out, and other folks have said it better, is that these are the required individuals at our meeting. They have to be there. The only times that they are excused is with prior written consent from the parent. So that's right now the way our system works, the IEP system. That's part of your notice of case conference. When you ask for excusal for a person, that's part of that notice. And it explains what legally that means, and it tells parents what they're signing off towards. So now if you have anyone outside of these 5 people, they don't have, prior written consent's not necessary for those people. So if I add more people beyond this list from the school's perspective, then they don't need, you just follow whatever procedures you have locally. Typically, they'll have something in writing, they'll share what they're going to share, and then they'll be released from the meeting. But that's up to a district on how you want to do that. You can make everyone have prior written consent in the district if you want to. You just can't be you can't mess with these folks right here. So we're going to talk about some of these roles. But this, I don't know. Questions about that one? I thought Angie was going to raise her hand. Yep, she is. There we go.
Question.
It's not a question.
I'm
I
going
said
to add
questions.
to this a little bit. So one of the things that you need to think about is, number one, who are in those roles.
Yeah.
And these are always a requirement. However, there are some situations where you have additional people who might be required, And it just depends on the situation. On the Padlet, there is a short little video presentation that we did on required members of the case conference, and it goes into a little more detail about that excusal process, how to do it, what has to be included, whether that person needs to provide written input into the IEP prior to the case conference. It depends on whether they're going to be there for part of it or not. So you can get more information on that on the Padlet.
Can one person have 2 roles?
Yes. However, what you don't want, and we see this sometimes in districts where the speech path serves as the special ed teacher and the public agency representative. I would highly
Right.
discourage you from doing that.
I usually remind folks that it's supposed to be a case conference committee meeting, not a
Yes,
case
not a-
conference interview. So think about it. If we only have 2 people, it's a protection for you, really, because it's just, if there's just 2 people in the room, then that's just those 2 people's agreement. If there's more, you have a little bit more leeway. Also, from an operational standpoint, you get better ideas the more people are involved. So it's, I've seen a lot of cases where it's quicker because it's hard to get a gen ed teacher in my room. It's hard to get public agency representative in there. So I just held the meeting. And technically, that's not a valid case conference if you don't have, that's actually could be called a denial of FAPE if you don't have the right people in the room. And that's due process has shown that a few times. So
And most of the time, you're going to have your special ed teacher also serving as the instructional
Right.
strategist, unless you've just had an evaluation.
Right.
So there's definitely some overlap in roles.
Yep.
But you've got to make sure these roles are filled. So like if I'm the gen ed teacher and maybe this kid has 5 gen ed teachers, you got to have one that is there from start to finish unless they have an excusal.
Right.
But you still may cycle other people in and out of that meeting to say, I just want to come in, give my 2 cents, I'm out the door. But
Somebody.
filling the required roles means start to finish, which is hard. It's really hard.
So I'm going to get to this one. I'm going to try to do this one. So we just talked about this one. If there's not, yes, ma'am.
I just have a quick question.
Sure.
So,
That's what they all say. Quick question.
well, I hope it's quick.
Oh, it's all right.
If, for example, a general education teacher, the day of the meeting, something happens, are you recommending that we stop the meeting then and not ask for the parents?
So that was actually my question that's up on the screen right there. So what should happen in that situation? So we get to a meeting and you know what, we get a call, I get a call, I'm the teacher of record, I get a call, my son's sick, maybe go into the emergency room, what do I do? So those kind of situations, if those people are that important to have at the meeting, it's really weird because I've read through those cases, the parent may give you consent in the moment, but it says prior written consent. So even though that's okay with me, it's not okay with Article 7 to do that. So we have to, the right people have to be at that meeting. So really what we should do, I'm going to answer this question because it's almost lunchtime, is reconvene that meeting. Have the right people there. And I know it can be inconvenient for everybody there, but it's a little more inconvenient to go to due process if someone called. Because the particular case I'm thinking of is something happened. Well, gen ed teacher was at the meeting. They had to leave. The parents said it was okay, and they documented it that way. A week passes, and there's a due process filing because the school should have known better. That's essentially what it is. You should know that that's prior written consent necessary to excuse folks. So even if the parent says it's okay, it's still your prior written consent for that excusal is the key words. Prior written consent. So before the meeting, in writing, documentation of the parent's consent to excuse for the person for all or part of the meeting. So that whenever I go through this, that's when the sidebar conversation starts. It's always a challenging one. Yes, Angie.
So think about it this way. If I'm the parent, I'm already at a disadvantage, right? I mean, I just am. That's the nature of the beast. And I sit down and somebody says, okay, either you didn't sign the form, which most of the time they don't, right? We send home that notice of conference. We hope that they're going to put a signature on, send it back to school. Most of the time it doesn't happen. But if I sit down at the table and they say, you know, Mrs. Smith is sick, we'd like to have Mrs. Jones instead. I mean, how confident am I going to be in saying, no, I need Mrs. Smith there? I mean, I'm probably, as a parent, going to say, oh, okay, that's all right. Or so-and-so needs to leave early. Are you okay with that? I'm probably
Right.
not okay, but I'm not going to say it. And so this is why the law says we need to give the parent information about that ahead of time. And also, so that next piece, it's on your next slide though, I think, or
yeah.
maybe the previous one,
That's
that
next.
if I am the person who's excused, I can put together something that gives my input into the development of that IEP so that my knowledge is not wasted, right?
Or
So
lost.
it's inconvenient as heck, but it's something that hopefully we can catch. If I know at
Yeah.
8 o'clock that morning that this gen ed teacher is sick and I can contact the parent and say, look, the gen ed teacher is sick, could I have the math teacher sit in instead? To me, that's still prior notice, but I'd want to make the change and
the
email
notice.
them that copy
Yeah.
really quick so it's
Yeah,
in writing.
That's the key. It doesn't say 15 minutes prior to a meeting. I would, like Angie mentioned though, it's like, hey, we had a change, please sign here. That would be a little bit of a push
Yeah.
on parents to do
It's
that.
abusing our
Yeah.
power as
I'm trying
the
to think
school.
what the legal term is, but there is one for that. So, and it's not a good thing. So just be thoughtful. Be thoughtful about those things. If things do change and you have notice, or in the situation we're talking about also, if it's it may be that, I don't, maybe the meetings run, because one thing we can't do is necessarily put time limits on a meeting. We can only meet for 2 hours today, and then the case conference is over. And whatever we decide, we decide. I've been around those meetings like that before. We can't really do that. You know, if the meeting carries on past the, 45 minutes, 50 minutes that we have set aside, then what we do is reconvene. You know, same thing would happen here. If someone has to leave at a scheduled time, they've got to go take their kid to band practice and there's no one else to take them. So it doesn't really matter the reason. If you need to go, you need to go. Halt the meeting and reconvene. Start from where you left off so you can continue. Just so you don't get tripped up with some of those procedural issues from there. So right here, one more question. They'll make it, if it's a long one, we're gonna, okay.
It will be.
It will be, okay.
So what happens if the gen ed teacher can't come? The meeting is about to start, the gen ed teacher can't come. And the parents say, oh, I don't have time to come back. Like, I can't take off work then. Or
Right. Well, I
do
think
have to
that's,
sign prior consent then? Or
it's still, the rules don't necessarily change. So the question was, if it just happens, we're getting ready to have the conference and it doesn't matter. Usually, for some reason, we get dumped on the gen ed teachers a lot in this situation, but one of our core people can't be at the meeting, just can't be there for whatever reason, then what do we do? And the parent comes back with, well, I can't take off work. This is my one time I can. What am I supposed to do with a situation like that? So what do you guys do? I'm sure you're not the only person to have that situation happen, but what kind of things happen? And Angie, I'm sure I'll have a jump in on this one, maybe. But I guess what I fall back to is the rules don't really change as far as excusal and those pieces go. It may be something if we can find, like, I know it's a scramble, but if we can find someone, it's still, before the meeting begins, find someone to fill the role.
But that still goes back to what's her name?
Angie.
Angie was just saying that if we do find someone
Yeah.
in that moment, that means that the parent may accept.
Well, the parent could still deny that too. They could deny the excusal. They could say, well, I don't. Well, let me put it this way too. This is down the rabbit hole also is, there's two different lists. You know, we get to propose who we want to invite. Well, the Notice of Case Conference does a lot of things. One of the things it does for us is shares who we expect to have at the case conference. So the parent really doesn't get to weigh in on who. Now, if it's going to be a problem and it's not a big deal, I might say, okay, fine, we can substitute somebody out. But you have to be really careful going down that pathway. As this person has relevant, necessary information for this case conference, they have to be there. So if the parent objects to that, I'm sorry, but that's, and just like we don't get to object to who they bring to a meeting either. The parents can bring whoever they please to that piece. But as in that situation, I don't see a way around the rules there. It's kind of cut and dried in that piece. So like Angie said, it's inconvenient, but the parent can't be there. We'll have to figure out a time they can. We can figure out different ways over phone, virtual, throw out those options also. Doesn't have to be in person. Ideally, that's what we can do, but with the options we have today, I think that there'd be some ways to throw it out. So if we can figure out a time you can jump in on lunch, go out to your car and get into it, we'll do it, but we have to figure it out. You know, that's a problem. It's solvable, but it's not real comfortable, I guess. Yes? Yep.
No, I was gonna say, that's what we've done in the past, is like our speech, we do teletherapy for
Okay.
speech. And she had just a heck of a year with her kids being sick and some family crises, and at the last minute, she wasn't able to come in. So what we did was we always offered, if she's not gonna be able to make it, do you wanna reschedule?
Mm-hmm.
And usually 9 out of 10 times the parents said no, but our speech therapist would then hold her portion and do it either phone conference or
Yeah.
Zoom or
Well, you
Google
can
Meet.
do hybrids of all that stuff too.
Yeah.
You know, we do that it's not always the best solution, but if they can be on phone, I mean, back in the day we had the little desktop phone we had to use, but you can use Zoom and Google Meets or whatever. So one person can be virtual and the rest can be in person. You just have to figure out the logistics of those kind of things, because that can be
And then we always documented it,
Yeah.
that this is due to da-da-da-da-da.
Right.
And we made sure in additional notes,
Yep.
we would document that the parent did give verbal consent, you know, kind of
Right.
that way.
Yeah,
So
it-
that we kind of
it-
did the little CYA.
You got to keep in mind too that Article 7 was written before all this virtual stuff even came around. So it barely mentions electronic mail within that piece, and when it says written, it means written. Doesn't mean, when it says signed, it wants an actual signature. So none of those things are in the rule, but it still meets the correct, you know, they're still there. They're still, the important thing is that the parent or whomever is a actual participant in the meeting, not just a face on a screen. You know, they're actually participating in the conversation. They can actually have a say in what's going on.